Mixing with Mike mixing tip, mixing without solo buttons. One of the most powerful ways that you can work with a mix to kind of pull it together quickly is to start by putting a mix together without using solo buttons. Or if you're using solo buttons, have whole groupings of instruments in. So rather than going to the classic technique where you open up a plugin and you just kind of work with the kick sound and then you finish that up and then you go on to the snare sound and you get your snare EQ. And then you go and you get your overhead sound. What you really want to do is you want to work with these guys together. So if you're getting the kick drum sound, especially like within the drum kit, what I would like to do typically is to have all of my drums. So in other words, if I'm doing something with the room sound here and I want to affect it in a particular way, like say for example, like I wanted to give it a little bit more snap or something like that, I can really hear what it is that I'm doing as I'm sweeping the frequencies in here. Well, how is it affecting the snare? How is it affecting the kick drum? And then kind of work with the settings here. And even if I'm exaggerating it, even if I'm exaggerating the effect, I can kind of get what's going on a little bit more, how it affects it, then go back, solo the individual track, maybe tweaking the sound, because so much of what happens here is how it affects other things. So for example, if I'm working with the kick drum sound and I'm trying to get the low end of this right, I really want to be working with the bass sound in at the same time. So if I'm adding in on my kick drum here, you know, the low end, and now I got this pre-dynamic, so here, let's just see. So I can get a sense of like how is this affecting the bass sound, or how is the bass sound, if I'm adding in low end, affecting the punchiness of the kick drum. So I may find, for example, by working this way, that to get more punchiness out of the kick drum, I need to actually take away more low mids rather than adding low frequencies into the kick drum. Or just add a little volume. And so I'm just going to play with the kick drum sound here and the amount of compression. Or maybe what I want to do here is kind of go up a little bit higher in the frequency, or kind of widen that Q on the attack for the kick itself. Click it to a higher frequency. And now I can hear this. So if I'm working with this, I want to also be monitoring other things that I'm working at. So here I am, like. So as I'm working in the kick drum sound, if I just start, say, like solo it up and I find a frequency that makes it really punchy, it may be interfering with the congas, the shaker, the guitar. So I want to find that frequency there on the attack that's not interfering with other instruments. So this is a way that I can, you know, work with instruments all within conjunction with each other. Another very common thing that can happen, like is bass, you know, guitars and clav sounds. So if I'm finding a frequency that makes that clav come out and it's like around 800 cycles, and I'm trying to find a note, an area for the bass that works in a similar range here, I may want to go a little bit lower to bring that note out in the bass so that it's not interfering. And then I also have the, this is the guitar. And I'll pull up that electric bass here. So this is here. So here I want to find, again, a frequency here. I'm boosting on the electric guitar that's not taking away from the snappy. This is a snare. It's not covering up the bass. So even just lessening that a little bit, still hear plenty of the guitar in there. So all of these instruments can kind of work together. And so it was a very common technique for me to like to put my bass next to my kick drum for exactly the same reason. I can call up the plugins for both as, and I'm working with the EQ, getting the low end to work together between the kick and the bass, between the guitars and the keyboards and other instruments that need more of those mid-range frequencies, and kind of finding and striking a balance. So when I'm working, although I'm working with solos, is with a large grouping of instruments. So if I'm working with the drums, listening to what I'm doing with the kick drum, how am I filtering the low end out of the overheads? How does that affect? Like that's a real like a quick, easy exercise here that I can show you. Just so I'm going to work here, for example, with the let's see, with the drums and the bass. And so here with the, let's go to the overhead track here. So I'm filtering off the low end here of, you know, of the overheads to help to control the, how it affects the kick drum. So notice that when I take this out, how that kick drum all of a sudden doesn't have as much body on it. So, and what that's doing is, because there's not a perfect phase relationship between the two, there's a little bit of a cancellation of the overheads to the kick drum. So by filtering some of that out, I'm allowing the kick drum to have more of its own natural frequency. And I think maybe I can do something here with this kick drum where I give it a little bit more. Or maybe work with it at a wider Q. And maybe not so aggressive on the bottom end here. But in the context of listening to this with the bass, or if there were other low instrument keyboards, I could really hear the effect of what I'm doing. And each filter shape that I'm selecting here in the context of everything else allows me to get a better idea of what I'm doing.
The cliffs look down, inviting me to crash against the shore, increase in a bee's hay. Had a vision that fades away, the two of us living happily in the jungle under the trees, singing harmonies with the birds and bees. Hey, don't wanna end up with war inside. Don't wanna end up with war inside. Don't wanna end up with war inside. Cause when there's war inside, you got no place to hide.
Just trying to find the attack on the kick drum.
Now she's dropping the bomb on me. Like a prisoner, she must be free. The gun go off inside my head. Can't protect myself. My ego's full of lead now. So many nights.
Right. So as I go through, what I'm doing is I'm sweeping some of the frequencies for the kick to find a hole in the mix where that kick attack can really stick through.
Her right in front of me. She's the mountains and I'm the sea. The cliffs look down, inviting me to crash against the shore, increase in a bee's hay. Had a vision that fades away. The two of us living happily in the jungle under the trees, singing harmonies with the birds and bees. Hey, don't wanna end up with war inside. Don't wanna end up inside. You got no place to hide now. Now she's dropping the bomb on me. Like a prisoner, she must be free.
So somewhere in that 2K range seems to be like a nice hole where the kick doesn't interfere with the guitars. So this is something that if you just primarily work in solo, what's going to happen is you'll get this great kick drum sound and a great snare drum sound, a great overhead sound, and all these guitars, and then you mix things together. And what ends up happening is that you realize it's like, wow, all these things are interfering with each other. It sounds like a big cluttered mess. And the reason is you have too many things that in solo may sound great in full frequency, but in the context of the overall mix, and it is a mix, you have too many things that are trying to occupy the same frequency area. And whenever you have that, what happens is the instruments start to glue together. It's almost like magnets. Like when they occupy too much of a too similar space, they just sort of snap together. And then what ends up happening is that they get clumped together, the sound pulls up into the speakers, you lose the sense of openness, and it becomes hard to listen to. You have too much. So what you're really doing is kind of focusing in sounds, clearing away areas where they interfere with each other, focusing the attacks or whatever it is you need so that each of those individual instruments can kind of work together. So particularly if you're working with an additive side of things, you may play a lot with the cue. Like I did this with the kick drum on the low end, and I realized that going to the shelving EQ allowed a little bit more of the thump of the kick drum, which wasn't really popping through, to work without really interfering with the bass sound. And so on every level, all these things work. When you bring in the vocals, this is why I try to stay away with guitars of boosting too much in the 5K presence range, because the vocals really need that so much. You lose a lot of the articulation if you start boosting those frequencies. And there's a natural tendency to do so with instruments because it really makes them come forward in the mix, but at the expense of interfering with the vocal. You get this a lot with acoustic guitars, interfering with vocals and things like that. So by mixing with larger groupings of instruments and working with these things together, you can really pull your mix together actually a lot faster, even if you do it on a more gross overall level, solo in and focus in and fine tune it a little bit. And then you'll start to really catch like all of the openness and depth and imaging that you're really looking for when you get a mix. All right, there's a mixing with Mike mixing tip. Mixing not really without solo buttons, but maybe perhaps a better way of saying it is with a larger grouping of instruments as you work with them, especially with EQ.